Understand. So yes, sir. It's 5 o'clock, sir.
2 minutes.
Sujit sir, with your permission, before we start, I would just like to make 2, 3 announcements so that the meeting can commence in a smoother way.
I'm glad to welcome Mr. Sujit Ghosh. He is regularly appearing in our Madras High Court. He's just one thing I got to know, come to know that he's a ex-student of National Law School of University Bangalore. I'm glad to know that. And he is regularly appearing in our High Court. He has rich experience in tax class. I hope that his session today will be interesting to all. So I sincerely welcome Mr. Sujit Ghosh, and now it's over to Mr. Sujit Ghosh. Thank you, sir.
Sir, I'm sorry, sir. So before we start, sir, I just got to know that one of judges of the
Yes.
one of the judges of Telangana High Court, Justice Chala Konanda Raman, has joined us. Thank you, Your Lordships, for joining this meeting. Srinivasa, you can just tell a few words to our honorable justices.
We are glad to welcome honorable judges on the board. We are from Madras Tax Bar. We are regularly conducting this kind of seminars. And Sujit Ghosh is well known to us, sir. He is regularly appearing in our High Court. So you have decided to call Mr. Sujit Ghosh, and he has also was ready to accept our invitation. And he also informed that your Lordship was also joining with us. We are sincerely welcome you also, sir, and other dignitaries and eminent, sir. Now it is over to Mr. Sujit Ghosh, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Srinivasa.
Thank you all. Good evening to all the participants that have come together today. It's actually a great privilege for me to be talking to the Madras Bar. It is with a great pleasure, I must say, that I enjoy every time I am there in your High Court. I can't miss the juice center that is across the road at the MBA gate. So that is a nice place that I often spend time. I love the architecture of that particular High Court, and the lawyers are so helpful. Thank you very much for inviting me. And I hope today's session is going to be enriching not only for you all, but also for me. The topic that I've chosen is controversial, without an iota of doubt. Many matters are pending before the High Courts in several High Courts. Given that the whole objective is for excellence in academic pursuit, I have tailored it not in the form as I would argue before a court, but a balanced view is being sought to be provided so that it appears to all of you in a manner as if you are a judge, as if you are trying to see both the sides of the coin. So if you have any strong views of what a particular point of law, I would appreciate that, I would respect that, but I would also not want to impose my point of view on you, because you all are excellent lawyers, you all are rich in your experience in tax matters. I'm sure you'll have your point of view. So what you're going to hear from me is probably a balanced view. And with those short words, let me jump into straight away with the particular presentation that I have for you. Can I have the slide share possibility, Prithvi?
Yes, sir.
Prithvi?
I'm just doing it, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So in today's time frame that is available to me, the topic that we're going to discuss is levy of service tax and GST on royalty payments and government services. This is a vexed issue. It's a fairly new issue that has come about, and the challenges that we see on a daily basis on large number of projects and contracts is enormous. The revenue implications could be in excess of 5,000 crores if I were to add everybody together. Be that as it may, what I'm intending to cover are these 8 points for you. First is setting the context. Second are what are the relevant legal provisions that governs this particular dispute area. Third, what is the constitutional framework governing the power to levy tax on mining and oil exploration? Assuming the government of India had the legislative competence, are the preconditions for imposition of the tax is satisfied or not? Next is assuming that both of them, in terms of their legislative competence as also precondition for imposition, is there, whether it's a very critical aspect which is called an assignment, because that seems to be a relevant taxable event that the government seems to be talking about, whether that is satisfied. And then there is a very nuanced point on how the delegated authorities or delegated legislations are being used to impose tax, whether those delegated legislations are valid, do they carry any weight, and can the government carry on with those delegated legislations, and how to deal with that. And the slide 7, the section 7 is all about what is the latest position on this aspect insofar as various high courts are concerned and insofar as the Supreme Court is concerned. And then I'll spend some time on the GST aspect. What is the position under GST? The reason why I kept GST at the end is as follows. Unless we are able to appreciate what has happened in service tax era, it may not be very easy for anybody to appreciate what is likely to happen under the GST era, because the two laws are intertwined. They're woven together from the same umbilical cord, and the essence of what a service has not gone through a change. What was a service back then is likely to remain a service now, because after the negative list regime, the definition of service under service tax law went through a roof change, and that width of definition of services has continued under the GST regime. So therefore, the discussion that we're going to make on service tax is equally going to be relevant from a GST perspective. And then some closing remark. So there are 4 sectors that by and large are significant.
Sir, I'm sorry, sir. Can I just interrupt for a minute, sir?
Yes, please.
I'm very sorry, sir.
Yeah.
Participants, you're requested to kindly not touch the screen sharing, because if you touch or if you make any underlines or any marks in there, everyone can see it. So kindly, you're requested not to do it. And in case if you have done it by mistake, there is an option to clear that also. So you can clear it yourself, because we can't do anything about it. So I request all the participants to please not to touch the screen sharing, because it is reflected to everyone. And yes, thank you so much, sir. I will stop the screen sharing again, and then again you can reshare it so that all these things will go off, sir. There are a lot of scribblings around.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, sir. You can start again, sir. I'm sorry for the interruption, sir.
No problem. Can you all see it now?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We can see it, sir. It is clear.
Perfect. So there are 4 industries that I have noticed are suffering the brunt of this levy. It all started on April 1, 2016, when this whole concept of levy of service tax on government services was introduced by way of a very nuanced amendment to the law. The 4 industries that are grappling with this are as follows: the oil and gas sector, the mining sector, it could be minor mines, major, whatever, the telecom sector, and of course the liquor industries. These four sectors have significantly been affected by this levy. There could be other sectors as well, but more or less these four kind of covers about 80 to 90% of the tax load. As I said, there are several writ petitions that are pending before the High Court. So therefore, to that extent, the matter is sub judice. And therefore, the last point I'm making is I want to give a balanced view. I'm not holding anybody's brief, and therefore, the attempt is going to be, today is going to be the day I could be a revenue counsel, I could be a tax assessing counsel, more like an amicus query, if you will. That's the perspective. That's how I like to present it. So 65B of the service tax, the finance tax spoke about what is a service. It spoke about services to mean an activity to be carried out. Now, mark the word activity, and what is the meaning of activity we'll delve into a little while from now. And then we had the negative list, which said that anything that falls within the negative list is not to be liable to service tax, except, and it created an exception. Up to 1/4/2016, support services by government formed part of the exception to the negative list. So if it was a support service, then it was liable to tax. And that definition of support services, or the extent of exclusion of support services, should be drawn from 1/4/2016 to then read, any services provided by the government to the business entities is not part of the negative list, which means any services provided by the government to business entities is a service that is liable to service tax. That's how it has to be read with. Now, a notification came about in 2012 to say that the reverse charge liability on all of these services by the government will apply, and the only exception that they gave was about immobile property. So, in short, if there is a government services provided which is taxable after 1/4/2016, then the liability to discharge service tax was on the recipient of the services, which means business enterprises will have to discharge the tax liability. The Rule 7 of the point of taxation rules and Rule 5 of the point of taxation rules, these are two important rules. Effectively, they said that your obligation to discharge tax liability, your point of tax is the date when you have received the payment. So if it is a new service, and this was a new service because from April 1, 2016, it came to be liable to tax for the first time. So it was a new service. So if it is a new service, mark this word. If you have received the payment after the new service came into force, meaning thereby if you receive a payment in May, June, July 2016 onwards, you're liable to pay tax. Or if you have received the payment prior to 1/4/2016, but the invoices was raised 14 days from the date of coming to force of the levy, which is for up to 15th, if the invoice was raised on 15th of April 2016 onwards, then you will be liable to tax. Now, the precept of the levy, or the arena that the government kind of created, the perimeter for the levy, was essentially the date when you actually received the payment or you raised the invoice. It had no connection whatsoever with the date when the services were performed. It's a very vital point I'm making, and I'll come back to this point later in the discourse. But that is something that I want you to appreciate, that the levy was ordained on the basis of the date of receipt of payment or the date of raising of invoices, depending upon whether you received the payment post the coming into force or whether you received the payment prior to coming into force. And then they came out with a very interesting exemption notification, which is exemption notification 25 of 2012, which basically said government services, insofar as assignment of right to use natural resources are concerned, they are exempted, provided the assignment of right to use happened prior to 1/4/2016. And then they put a condition. The exemption was restricted to only one-time charge payable in full or in installment, meaning thereby, if the assignment took place, let's say in March of 2016, and there was a one-time payment that the business enterprise had to pay to the government to receive the assignment, then that one-time payment that they made was not liable to tax. But if there were any periodic payments that had to be made, periodic payment extending over the period of the right that was subsisting in favor of the recipient of the license or recipient of the assignment of right to use, so to say, then those periodic payments were taxable or were not exempted, even if the assignment took place prior to 1/4/2016. Now, this notification and the Rule 5 of POTR, I would want you to appreciate very nuancedly, very clearly, because this has some significant constitutional issues, significant validity issues, which I'll deal with in the subsequent slides. So 2 points I want you to remember. The levy comes into force from April 1, 2016. Obligation to discharge the tax arises if you have received payment after 1/4/2016. The exemption is available if the assignment took place prior to coming to force, but that exemption is restricted to only one-time payment and not to periodic payment. In summary, therefore, if there are period payments that are received after 1/4/2016, and I repeat, if there are periodic payments received after 1/4/2016, even though the assignment may have taken place prior to 1/4/2016, you are liable to tax. If there is a one-time payment that has to be received and the assignment took place prior to 1/4/2016, you are not liable to tax. These are the two very important fulcrum that you need to appreciate as we go down the chain. Now, so therefore, the sequitur to this exemption notification I've already explained. I'll just read it out for your benefit. It basically indirectly tells us that there is a charge of tax on the basis of date of receipt of payment and date of raising of invoice. It does not suggest that the charge of tax is strictly on the basis of taxable event. It's a very crucial point. Even if the taxable event took place prior to the levy coming into force, tax payable if payment received after levy comes into force, or invoice received raised after 14 days from the coming to force. Exemption not applicable to periodic payments in any case. Exemption, of course, they have given some sector specific exemption to agriculture, etc. That is not relevant. That's a very small item. We need not bother about that. So the sequitur to this exemption notification and the interpretation of Rule 5 of the point of taxation rules is very, very critical for us to appreciate the disputes that are to come about. And then the government came out with a circular, as it often does whenever there is a new service. The TRU circular came about. It made three very important points, and that these 3 points are very relevant for us. Irrespective of whether or not the nature of the activity is statutory or mandatory requirement under any law, it will be liable to service tax. So the defense that used to be available to people that government cannot be liable to, government cannot be said to be rendering services, because wherever it does so in the capacity as a statutory authority, which is mandatory in nature, that exception or that defense seems to have been poked, that defense seems to have been breached by virtue of this circular, clearly stating that statutory and mandatory requirement under which the government does any activity will not be an exception. It will still be treated as a service. That's a significant departure, I must say. Then payment in lieu of any permission or license granted by the government or local authority is to be covered by that. And there are any number of payments that people do make for any licenses that you obtain in the panchayat, in the municipality, in the districts, state, whatever else. And presence of quid pro quo is very, very necessary. It's a necessary concomitant, because as we all know, a contract is all about quid pro quo. A service or a supply of goods is all about quid pro quo. You provide something and you receive consideration. The consideration could be in the form of money, the consideration in the form of kind, whatever else, but there has to be a quid pro quo. And then serial number 9 of that particular circular is very, very interesting. It says service tax is payable on yearly installments of spectrum after 1/4/2016, even though the spectrum assigned prior to 1/4/2016. And then they go on to say spectrum user charges, license fee in respect of spectrum, monthly payments on coal extraction, or royalty payable on extracted coal are all kinds of payment which qualify as periodic payment. And when it is periodic payment, as I mentioned a little while back, exemption does not, even though the assignment may have taken place prior to 1/4/2016. So this is another very important dimension I would like you to appreciate. Now, what we're going to do in the next 25-30 minutes, and subject to time permit, maybe it's a little more, we're going to test the levy on constitutional propriety. We're going to test the levy in terms of whether the levy can pass the litmus of the constitutional controls provided under Article 246 back in those days, and 246A in the GST era. So therefore, these are the relevant entries that I want you to appreciate that are pertinent for this particular discourse. So entry 53 of list 1, or 7th schedule, the union government has the power to regulate and develop oil fields and mineral oils and petroleum products. Entry 54, again of the union list, gives the central government or the parliament regulation power to regulate mines and mineral development. So oil and gas and mines falls under 53 and 54. Both these entries confer a regulatory power on the parliament to legislate. Legislate qua the regulatory aspect of coal mines or in terms of oil and gas fields and so on and so forth. Entry 97, as we all know, is the residuary power available with the union to impose any kind of tax or bring in any kind of legislation. But entry 97 comes with some caveats. We'll discuss that subsequently. Then you have entry 23 of the list 2 of the 7th schedule. Now, this is very important. Just as the union government has the power to regulate mines, entry 23 also gives equal power or similar power to the state government or the state legislature. It says regulation of mines and minerals development subject to provisions of list 1 with respect to regulation and development under the control of the union. So subject to whatever union may have legislated upon and subject to those caveats, the state governments also have power to regulate mines. So minor minerals falls under that. Then you have entry 50, which is a very important entry in the list 2. That confers power on the state government to tax mineral rights. So tax on mineral rights subject to any limitations imposed by the parliament by law relating to mineral development. Now, entry 53 therefore suggests two very important points. Ex facie, the power of the state exists to legislate in a manner that mineral rights can be taxed. That power to levy tax on mineral right is exclusively within the state's jurisdiction, not of central government. The only caveat is that state's power to impose a tax on mineral rights is subject to any limitation that the union may prescribe, which means if there is any limitation that the parliament may have imposed on the states, debarring it from imposing a tax on mineral rights, then the states are helpless. States cannot impose any such tax. So what we will have to appreciate is whether this levy of service tax on some of these government services that we spoke about fits into either entry 50 or does it go under 97? Does it draw its power under 53? Does it draw its power under 54? And so on and so forth. And 246, 246A and 248. 248 is the residuary power of the union to legislate. 246 is the plenary power of and the center to legislate. And 246A is the new avatar of GST, which we'll talk about when we come to that. So entry 50 is what we're going to first start our discussion on. So it says state government has power to levy tax on mineral rights. So the question is, what is a mineral right? Now, mineral right has been defined by the Black's Law, and bunch of judicial decisions have also appreciated and interpreted that particular thing. Effectively, right to receive royalty based on production of minerals is nothing but mineral right. So if there is any right that any government accrues to receive royalty, then such a right is nothing but a mineral right. If there is any tax that is to be imposed on such right to receive royalty, then that is nothing but a tax on mineral right. Okay, just keep that in mind. And tax on mineral rights is equal to tax on royalty. That is what there are two Supreme Court decisions back in the day, 61 and 991, where the Supreme Court had very clearly brought out that a tax on mineral right is equal to tax on royalty. Now, bear in mind, if the government of the state or the state legislature has the power to levy a tax on mineral right, i.e. tax on royalty, then for sure that falls within the precepts of entry 50 list 2. And in that situation, the central government or the parliament cannot interfere, cannot impose any further tax on that particular royalty. Because if you realize what is service tax is what is service tax sought to be levied on, the value on which service tax is sought to be levied on essentially is a royalty insofar as mining leases are concerned, insofar as oil and gas is concerned, or the periodic payment that one pays under the telecom, that is also in the form of a royalty. So if the union is justifying the levy to say that it is effectively taxed on the royalty portion, well, that royalty, a tax on a royalty is nothing but a tax on mineral right. That power exclusively falls within the state's domain. If that be the case, two questions begs our consideration. First, is there any limitation that the parliament has imposed on that power of the state government to impose tax on mineral right? Because we saw entry 50 comes with a caveat. It comes with an exception that yes, states are permitted to levy tax on mineral rights, but if there are any limitations that the parliament has put in, then the states have to close their shop and they cannot legislate on that. So the first question we will have to answer is, are there any limitations that the parliament has imposed insofar as this is concerned? And the sequitur of that is, if there are no limitations that the parliament can be said to have imposed on the power of the state under entry 50, then I must confess my view is for sure that the parliament was incompetent to impose a tax or service tax on the royalty payments. So therefore, the key therefore is, was there any limitation that the parliament has imposed? And we'll try and see whether any limitations exist or not. So some of the limitations that can be seen that has been prescribed by the union government, the parliament, insofar as entry 50 is concerned, are provided under the MMRDA Act or ORDA Act or the PNG rule. MMRD is all about mineral regulation development, ORD is oil field regulation development, PNG is petroleum natural gas rules. These regulations, these legislations have been enacted by the central government seeking to regulate how business needs to be carried out insofar as these mines, these minerals, these oil fields, these oil and gas producers are concerned. I must also tell you very candidly, if you look at these legislations, you will not see an iota of a line which says that the propriety to levy tax on these activities shall be exclusively with the union. There is no specific limitation clause that can be found in any of this legislation. Another limitation that we can see is the Territorial Waters and Continental Shelf Zones Act, where they say that there will be power available with the federal government, with the union, to legislate with respect to whatever lies underneath the sea or the bed insofar as the exclusive economic zone is concerned, territorial waters are concerned, or is concerned. But that also gives a very risk that says that there shall be power with the central government to notify imposition of custom duty and other fiscal measures. But then that is the central government's delegated power to notify application of a law. It does not say that the parliament will legislate a law with respect to that for imposition of a fiscal levy insofar as that is concerned. Then we see Rule 5 of the PNGR rules, petroleum natural gas rules, that gives a limitation to say that, well, if there is any land, mineral underlying the ocean within the Territorial Waters and Continental Shelves Act that is vested with the union, then the lease can be granted only by the central government. That is a limitation. But then when it comes to the land-based acreages, where it is not in the Territorial Waters and Continental Shelves Act, which doesn't get covered there the state governments can grant the leases for carrying out all the activities of exploration, provided, of course, it seeks an approval of the central government. So these legislations, which have been enacted by the central government, by the parliament, using powers available to it under its regulatory function under 53, 54, etc., do not provide for any limitation for imposition of tax on mineral rights. It only provides how the regulation will carry on, how business will carry on. Now, the question therefore is, are we to say that these legislations are the only limitations that are available? If that answer is yes, then for sure, union government cannot be said to have any power to legislate or levy tax on mineral rights. That's the answer that comes out. So 3 questions begs our consideration, and these are the 3 questions that will come up before the judicial fora if and when those matters are brought up. First, can service tax be justified under Article 248 read with entry 97 of List 1? Because 97 and 248 gives the residuary power to the union government to impose any kind of tax. But 97 comes with a rider. You will not invoke power under 97 if a subject matter is specifically covered by List 2 or List 3. Since right to levy tax on mineral right is exclusively provided under List 2, the parliament cannot usurp that power using 97, because 97 says, yes, you have an inherent power to legislate on residuary items, but if it is covered by a specific country under the state list or concurrent list, you cannot exercise your residuary power. So therefore, nobody can stand up and say, I justify the levy of service under 97. That will be a long shot that will fall flat insofar as the interpretation of the law is concerned, interpretation of 97 is concerned. The second point that comes out is, can it be said that the Finance Act imposing service tax is a hybrid instrument seeking to tacitly limit the state's power under entry 50 by exercising power in 97. Meaning thereby, all of us know that there is a concept of implied repeal. So you don't have to specifically say that this legislation is repealed. If you come out with a subsequent legislation which by in form and substance is seeking to overturn what was there earlier on, then by virtue of the doctrine of implied repeal, you stand to repeal what was legislated in the past. Similarly, is there a doctrine of implied restriction or implied limitation that the federal government or the union can stand up and tell the courts that by virtue of the fact that I have enacted the Finance Act, where I have sought to levy a tax by the name service tax on royalty, I am impliedly putting a restriction or limitation on the state's power to levy tax on royalty? I don't have an answer of this point, but my immediate reaction on this doctrine of implied limitation would be as follows. Implied repeal has to still make a reference to the old position of law. Anything that is sought to be impliedly repealed has to be whether directly or otherwise make a reference to the earlier position that it is seeking to deal with, that is seeking to overturn. The Finance Act makes no bones about it. Finance Act makes no reference to that. No intention can be gathered, whether directly or indirectly, seeking to bring out this doctrine of implied limitation, if there is any such document that they can farm out. So I don't believe that the implied repeal as a concept can be read into it, or implied limitation can be read into it, seeking to restrict the power of the state government to levy a tax on mineral rights. The third point, can legislations enacted under entry 53 and 54 of the list 1, which confers power to the Union Parliament to regulate oil fields, etc., be construed as a limitation imposed on the state's power to tax mineral rights? Well, the fact of the matter is, every entry in the 7th schedule, any of the lists have to be interpreted as widely as possible. No doubt about that. That's the very established principle of law. Entries in Schedule 7, List 1, List 2, List 3 will have to be given its widest meaning. But even if you give a widest meaning, the entry 53 and 54, which confers power on the union government to deal with this subject, only provides that they shall regulate. And I'll take you back to that entry 53 and 54 once again. 53 says regulation and development on oil fields and mineral oils. 54 says regulation of mines and mineral development. Is it therefore possible for the union to say, by virtue of possessing a power to regulate, I can also impose a tax, or I can also limit the state governments from imposing a tax? Is that theory at all possible? I would believe that probably that would be a long shot, because the constitution, the way it was drafted, powers of regulation and powers of levy of tax are very well wedged out insofar as list 1 is concerned. So 82 to 92B of union list or list 1 exclusively provides power to the union government to impose all kinds of taxes, whether taxes on income, whether customs, excise, what have you. And if regulation has to be subsumed to mean levy of tax, then there was no need for having a separate entry for taxing entries or in the nature of taxing entries. The very fact that taxing entries have been specifically etched out from 82 to 92B, and the entry qua this particular concept restricts itself to entry 53 and 54, I don't believe it would be an appropriate construction to give width to 53 and 54 beyond what the purpose was. The purpose was to regulate. You can for sure regulate, but in the garb of regulation, imposition of a tax, that may not be wise, that may not be fair, that may not be justiciable, that may not be appropriate. So therefore, this is for the judiciary to take cognizance of, to figure out whether power to regulate confers ipso facto power to impose tax. That's a large issue, and I don't think we have enough time to go further deep into it. And therefore, I'm just raising this particular point for your consideration. Now, what is equally important are another set of points that comes out from judicial decisions of the past. What has been seen in this judgment? H.R. Prasad versus State of MP, and I want to read it out for your consideration so that you get a fair sense of what they had laid down. The principle is well settled that it is sufficient to say that the Parliament's power to impose tax on mineral right is evident even from entry 15 list 2, which speaks of limitations imposed by the Parliament in exercising of power under entry by the state legislature in addition to the taxing power of the parliament under 8054 with entry 97 and residuary power of the parliament. So this clearly says that parliament has the power to impose limitations, but it doesn't go on to say whether any limitation was ever brought into existence. The second is India Cements, 7 judges Supreme Court long back had held that royalty is itself a tax. That's another point that come out, that royalty per se is a tax. The Union of India comes out with this, the ministry comes out with a particular document, which is called the Report on Ministry of Mines, Report of the Ministry of Mines. There they say royalty is a payment of tax to the government for the ownership rights over the mineral rights, a privilege granted to him for mining and producing. And there was the judgment from the Patna High Court long back, Laddumal, where they said that, this whole royalty income goes to the consolidated fund of the particular state that collects it. So if it is a sum that goes to the consolidated fund of India or consolidated fund of the state, if I use that, if it is in the nature of a tax, if it is something that is payable according to the government reports, that it is in nature of a tax to the government, then the tax has already been imposed. The tax on mineral right has already been imposed, and such a tax has already been imposed by the federal government when it comes to royalties that is paid to the state central government coffers, or a state government where it goes to the state coffers. So once it has already taken the color of a tax, once royalty has taken the color of a tax, then a further tax on the same royalty, would it not be an unfair thing? Would it defeat the very objective for which taxes are imposed? Taxes are not levied on taxes ever, unless that tax becomes part of the basic value on which tax is to be levied. For example, sales tax was levied on basic supply, basic price of goods and excise duty. Therefore, sales tax applied on excise duty also. But per se sales tax was never applied on excise duty. Per se custom duty is never applied on excise. Per se GST is never applied on custom duty. So long as those duties are part of an overall value of the base product or supply, only then the taxes can apply, what is called the cascading effect of taxes. But here is a case where service tax is sought to be levied on the royalty component per se, and royalty component per se, some of these courts have held it to be tax itself. So how is it possible that service tax can ever be levied on something which is per se in the nature of a tax? That cannot be conscionable to my mind, because that goes against the very root of what Article 265 talks about. It is a compulsory extraction of monies, but that does not mean it can be a compulsory acquisition of money on the same value, which is also a tax. So that's the other point that we need to keep in mind, which is another aspect of relevance. Then we come to Article 289, which says that property of the state, union taxes are exempt. Of course, unless if the union is earning that income by virtue of trade, then that exception does not apply. So the question therefore comes about is when the state is parting its privilege to various people who are obtaining those licenses from the state, and here the word state, I mean the state legislature. Can the state be seen to be carrying on a trade? Because if it is carrying on a trade of parting of its exclusive privilege over those natural resources, then the protection of Article 289 cannot apply. But if there is no such trading that can be contemplated, if one can argue that the state is not parting of a privilege, there is no trade that is taking place, then for sure the attempt to levy service tax, to my mind, would be a tax on the property of the state, because as we said, the exclusive ownership over the natural resources, insofar as the state, insofar as land is concerned, will be with the state within whose jurisdiction it operates. Okay, so therefore that is something very relevant to keep in mind. Then there's another element of that. Tax on land, entry 18, which says the power to legislate with respect to land is with the state government. Okay, in or over the land is with the state government. Taxes on lands and buildings is also with the state government under entry 49. Land has been defined. There's a Supreme Court decision as well. It came from Gujarat, from municipal corporation. They were trying to ascertain whether land also includes anything that is below the land, and the Supreme Court very clearly said yes, it includes below the land. It was in the context of municipal taxes, and there that principle, if applied, land will include not only what is there on the surface of that, but also anything that is below it. So if there is any tax that is sought to be levied on the land, it would mean tax on any produce from the land as well. And if that be the case, exclusive proprietary to levy tax on the land is with the state government. Under that situation, the levy of service tax, can it therefore be said to be justifiable? That service tax is effectively, how do you levy it? It is being levied on the royalty. It is being levied on the various license fees. All of that is tied up to the produce. If you don't have any produce, you may not be required to pay that. Or if you pay a dead rent or a rent for the acreage that has been given to you, that is nothing but a rent that you pay on land. And any rent that is paid on the land, any tax that is sought to be levied is nothing but a tax on the land. So therefore, how does the union government justify the propriety of the levy, given that exclusive power to levy tax on land is solely with the state government? So can tax on royalty be imposed only by the state under 49 of the list 2? Therefore, this is the question that comes for a consideration. Is service tax substantially a tax on land and therefore an overreach by the parliament? If any stand up and say, no, let us look at what is called, different facets of a same transaction can have different taxes. The famous Supreme Court decision, they say that you have to look at the aspect theory. Maybe the tax on the land is one aspect, but service tax is the service element of that other aspect. So a probe will have to be given. Are there two aspects that we are dealing with? At the end of the day, extraction of mineral, if for extraction of mineral, I have to make a payment to the government, are there two separate aspects that one can talk about? One aspect of a service, other aspect of a tax on land. I don't believe there are any two aspects. I believe there's only one aspect, which is tax on extraction. In the good old days, the king would collect a royalty or a king would collect a tax because you are excavating from his land, because the land belongs to him, and you're going to exploit that produce and make a living for yourself, and therefore you must pay a tax. So if you go back in time, in the historical times, that this was nothing, royalty was nothing but a tax paid to the royal. And if it is a tax paid to the royal, there is no service element that can be seen. An artificially created service, if one were to interpose, that would, to my mind, be far-fetched. But then, of course, this is for the judges to figure out how they would like to distinguish, how they can see there's any separate aspect or multiple aspects of levy of tax on the produce from the land. Now, assuming that the central government does have the legislative competence, and we did a lot of conversation around that, the next question that comes for our discussion is, fair enough, assuming that there is a legislative competence and the union has the power to impose a service tax through the Finance Act and so on and so forth, are the preconditions of a service tax, which is consideration and performance of a service, satisfied? This section, we're going to discuss that. So the two elements of a valid levy of service tax is service should be performed and for a consideration. And services used to be defined under the Finance Act to mean an activity by one person for another for consideration. Mark the word activity. Activity has been defined in various judicial dictionaries, including Blackstone, to mean collective acts of any person. So it has to be more than one act to qualify as an activity. The question is, when the federal government or when the state government is granting you a license to carry on these kind of businesses, liquor license to carry on liquor, telecom license for you to operate as a telecom operator, oil and gas under license to carry out exploration, is it a one single act, or there are multiple acts that led to it? If it is a one single act, then it can't be an activity. But if it is a multiple activity, all of that comes up together to form an activity, only then it qualifies as a service. One way to look at is that there are no multiple activities. How does it happen? There is a bidding, you respond to that, you win. Until you have responded and you have won, you are a persona non grata. You have no rights that accrues to you. Only right you had probably is the right to participate. Okay, so therefore, if it is in the realm of alcohol, even though it is covered by res extra commercium, so long as the government has gone into private parties, has called private parties, Article 14 applies. Fair enough. You may have an equal opportunity to participate, but other than equal opportunity, you have no rights that can be said to accrue. The only time rights accrue to you is when the license is granted. That grant of license, to my mind, is a single act, a signing of a paper, or a single act through which a lease or an agreement is signed. It is this piece of paper through which the rights are accrued, rights vest onto the licensee or the lessee as the case may be, and the right is assigned or transferred as the case may be. If it is a single act, can anybody say that there was an activity? The other side will argue, well, in the run-up to the signing of the agreement, there are a bunch of things that the government did so that a successful winner would be granted an acreage or a granted license. Successive acts the government may have done, but there was no payment that I had agreed to pay for that. That activity was done by government at its own volition. There was no activity that was contracted with me for me to be paying for it. And therefore, any back-end activity in the run-up to grant of the license should not be considered as in the list of activities, a list of act to qualify as an activity. So therefore, the moot question therefore is, can there be an activity that is said to have existed in a situation such as this, where there is a one-time act of granting of a license? That's the first point. The second point, there's a deeming fiction that has been carved out insofar as telecom is concerned, where they use the word assignment by government of the right to use radio frequencies and subsequent transfer. There they seem to be saying that the charge of tax is on assignment of the right to use. What does the word assignment of right to use mean? Is it any different? Does it have any relevance in the context of oil sector or coal, etc., etc.? Can we draw some analogy? That is something that we'll discuss in the subsequent slide. So we don't see such a deeming fiction for liquor. We don't see such a deeming fiction for oil and gas. So one is really wondering, what is the taxable event? One aspect that people often come out with is that, look, it is not a service that the union can be said to have provided or the central government can be said to have provided, because anything that is a sovereign function cannot be said to be a service. The answer to that defense is as follows. The test of sovereign function has a very high upper threshold. Anything that is inalienable, primary, non-delegable function, that is a sovereign function. So collection of tax is a sovereign function, defense is a sovereign function, police services is a sovereign function. But merely because a state has a monopoly, that cannot mean that that is a sovereign function that the state is carrying out. Absence of profit motive or quid pro quo is also not determinative that there is a sovereign function. So this argument that it is a sovereign function will find an extreme difficulty to pass the muster if you were to apply the judicial precedents on what is a sovereign function. Look at it this way. One way to view it is that the very fact that all natural resources falls within the exclusive domain of the government of the day, whether it's union government or state government as the case may be, can it therefore, and it is only them who can exclusively carry on business in that unless they part with that privilege. Can we not say that exploitation is a sovereign function? And parting of that privilege, can it therefore be argued that it is nothing but it is an alienable thing, and therefore it disqualifies itself from a sovereign function? You can argue it on both sides. I would believe that this may not qualify as a sovereign function, more so because there is a parting of a privilege that takes place from the government to the private parties, and the private parties exploit and make a living out of it, and therefore if it was so sovereign, then probably it would not have been alienable at all. We haven't seen a situation where the defense of the country has been outsourced. We haven't seen a situation where the tax imposition or the power to levy tax has been outsourced. They're so integral to the government function that they are actually the sovereign function. This, to my mind, may be many notches below those kind of higher sovereign functions that are there. But then this is a disputable point that certainly will have to be considered. Now, so far as royalty is concerned, so the second test is failure. If it is a service, well, if it is not a service, or if it is a service, we still have to satisfy whether there is a consideration. Now, consideration 2D of the Indian Contract Act says that anything that I have agreed to provide in lieu of whatever I am receiving, okay, the reciprocal promise in that sense. Now, when royalty, and in the context of royalty, this slide is only about royalty. When royalty has been held by the Supreme Court by 7 judges to mean it is a tax, something that is a tax, it is absolute right of the government of India or government of the state concerned by virtue of 265 to appropriate. It goes to the Consolidated Fund of India. Once it is a tax, it can never be said to be a consideration. So to take an example, when I pay income tax to the government of India, that amount cannot be said to be a consideration that I've paid to the government. No, because as we all know in tax, there is no quid pro quo. If there is no quid pro quo, there can be no consideration. And therefore, tax is never a consideration that anybody pays to the government to remain a citizen of India. So if it is a tax, then it can't be a consideration. And if royalty is not a consideration, the levy of service tax on that amount cannot apply, because service tax will apply if there is a service and there is a reciprocal consideration that's received. The only money that flows from the licensee to the licensor is only royalty that the licensee pays. And that money, being in the nature of tax, cannot be treated as a consideration. Subsequently, after the 7 judges bench in India Cements, the 5 judges bench in Kesoram surprisingly questioned that judgment. They took a view that probably India Cement was wrong. It is probably not tax, and not probably, it actually said that it was not tax. And therefore they came about a conflict. And the conflict is now to be resolved by a 9 judges bench that has been set up in MMRDA's case, MADA's case, where the Supreme Court 9 judges are going to reconcile the difference of opinion between 7 judges and 5 judges. But be that as it may be, at the lower level, at the tribunal, and even at the High Court, I would go to that extent. A High Court is bound by, or a tribunal is bound by, a decision of a bench of the higher strength. So as long as the 7 judges bench decision of the Supreme Court has not been overturned, even though there may be a different view taken by a lower bench or a smaller bench of an inferior strength by 5 judges holding contrary, a High Court under 226 will be bound by the 7 judges bench. So therefore, ex facie, all courts, whether tribunal, should follow the 7 judges bench until and unless the 9 judges bench decision takes a contrary view. But surprisingly, what is happening is the revenue wants to perpetuate the Kesoram decision of 5 judges to say Kesoram held it not to be a tax, and therefore courts and tribunals should take a cognizance of that. And in that whole process, the very foundational principle of Dawoodi Bohra, where they are laid down that what is the principle of judicial discipline, or what kind of presidential principle that should be applied, is being taken for a run, taken for a ride, and none seem to be following it, and therefore confusions. I would believe that until 9 judges comes about with any kind of different view, 7 judges should rule the entire sphere. There's no reason for any debate whatsoever. Let everybody go back to Supreme Court and join hands there. But until the matter comes from Supreme Court, High Court should not be interfering in the matter. They should apply the principle of 7 judges and go on in life. Now, what we also see, aside of what 7 judges bench held, or how case took a different view, 5 judges took a different view, the ingredients of a taxing statute can be seen explicitly insofar as the Oil Regulation Development Act is concerned. So what do we need for a tax legislation? There should be a taxable event, there should be a taxable person, there should be a measure of tax, there should be a rate of tax. All those 4 fundamental components that Govind Saran, Ganga Saran had laid down, Supreme Court had laid down long back, can be seen insofar as Section 6A of the ORDA Act is concerned. What are those? Royalties to be paid as per scheduled rate on minerals excavated by licensee. So taxable event is prescribed, taxable person, the license is prescribed, the base of tax is also prescribed, the rate is also prescribed. So all the 4 events are there. Then there is a provision that provides an exemption from payment of royalty. Okay, taxing statute also contains an exemption provision. Then there is a penalty for non-payment of tax. There are fines for non-payment of tax. Every taxing statute will have such a provision as well. And there is a obligation to file a return. You file a return only when it is a tax. You don't file a return if it is a consideration that you have paid for any service, alleged services that you may have received from the government. So obligation to file return exists, fines for failure to pay tax, exemption from payment of tax, taxable person, taxable measure of tax, rate of tax, all of those things are nothing but fundamental precepts of any tax law. By that connotation as well, royalty is nothing but a tax, one would argue to that extent. Then we shift here from royalty and to license fee. It is not that every government services has a royalty. Some government services ask for a license fee. Now, license fee has to be understood in the right perspective. License fee could be taken by the government for discharging of regulatory function. Sometimes the government collects license fees which is in the compensatory nature. Some cases there are twin objectives, to raise revenue as well as regulate trade. So what the Supreme Court have held, what the High Courts have also said in so many words. I mean, there are judgments from the Andhra Pradesh High Court, there are judgments from the Allahabad High Court, there are judgments from Supreme Court, bunch of series of judgments where they have appreciated nuanced difference between regulatory and compensatory to hold only 2 very important points. Compensatory fee is something, if taken, there is a presumption that there is a service, because the government has provided some services and the government wants to be compensated for that. For example, a customs authority has been stationed at your factory, at your warehouse or an excise officer has been stationed at your factory, or a CISF personnel has been brought to your factory to guard, they need a compensation for the time that they have spent working for you, guarding your property and your life. Such be the case, it's a compensatory in nature, and therefore there is a service. But sometimes fees are taken to regulate. Fees are taken to regulate. There's a higher threshold that is prescribed so that not many people venture into the trade. Take the liquor industry for that matter. The government does not want to perpetuate. Government does not want anybody and everybody to be getting into the liquor trade. Therefore, they put a higher threshold for license fees. And the purpose of higher fee of license that is prescribed is essentially to regulate that any and everybody does not get into the trade. So regulatory function and compensatory function has to be clearly appreciated. Supreme Court, in the case of Liberty Cinema, had laid down a very detailed discussion on this particular point. And this nuanced aspect was also appreciated by the Allahabad High Court and Van Organics and then Supreme Court, etc., etc. Short point is compensatory fees is essentially for services. Regulatory fees, concept of service is absent. So if the government is taking a license fee for the purpose of regulation, then one can certainly argue that there is no service element. But if the government is taking money to compensate itself, then certainly there is a service. And this is a decision of Martin Lottery by the Supreme Court, where there is an obiter that can be seen, where they say raising of revenue not equal to provision of services. So if the government is trying to raise revenue by collecting royalty or whatever else that you may say, or license fee that wants to raise revenue, then that cannot be said that there is a service that is provided. And license fee for alcohol, they say, the Supreme Court actually observes, it is not for a service. So therefore, we can draw a leaf from some of these principles of regulatory function and compensatory function, a grant of license for regulation and compensation, to figure out whether there is a service or there is none. Okay. And if you look at the ORDA Act, Oil Regulation Development Act, there are a bunch of attributes of regulation that can be seen. Look for yourself, Section 5. I mean, the very preamble, it has been promulgated for regulation and development of oil fields. Look at Section 5, the very important, the power to make rules. It says regulating grant of mining leases, prescription regulation for use of any equipment, prohibitions on any assignment, restriction on production, all of this is regulatory function. So if for the purpose of regulation of mines, if for the purpose of regulation of the telecom waves, if for the purpose of regulation of the liquor industry, the government is prescribing a higher threshold as an entry threshold, then can it at all be said to be a service? That is the question. And by applying the Supreme Court test that regulatory function, there is no services involved, I would argue there is no service at all. Forget about any imposition of service tax. Okay, so that's one aspect that has to be kept in mind. And then you look at Article 110(2) and 199(2) of the Constitution. They deal with money bill. And in that money bill, in the prescription of money bill, the Constitution itself takes cognizance that there is a difference between fees for license and fees for services. Because they use the word fees for license, comma, fees for services. If fees for license was equal to fees for services, there was no need to have two separate phraseology in the same article. The very fact that legislature uses two different set of phrases to denote two different things goes to suggest that there is a distinction between fees for licenses and fees for services. And therefore, that is a very, very fundamental distinction that can be carved out to say, when I'm paying a royalty or when I'm paying a license fee, maybe that is being paid for purpose of regulatory purposes through the government, need not necessarily be for compensatory purposes, because fees for license need not ipso facto mean that there is a fees for services. And assuming that there is a combination of regulatory and compensatory reason. So let's say the government says, okay, I'm taking a license fee of 100 rupees from you. Some part of it is towards regulation. Some part of it is towards compensation. Okay. What happens then? Then the answer is very clear. When the machinery provision does not provide a manner in which a distinction or separation can be done of the taxable base, then such a levy has to fall. Meaning thereby, if the hypothesis is there is no service involved in regulatory fees, but there is a service involved in compensatory fees, but the regulatory fee and compensatory fee has been meshed together to form a single whole, and the statute does not provide you a means to bifurcate the thing, then the entire levy will have to fall. We will apply the decision of Bansal's case that Delhi High Court had laid out. It was also applied in the Supreme Court. It brings out the concept from Supreme Court, and also and there are income tax decisions on that particular aspect to say that if the machinery provision does not exist, then the charging section will have to fall, and therefore that will have to be applied. So the point I'm trying to make for all of your benefit is as follows. We need to appreciate the distinction, if any, between fees for regulation and fees for compensation. If they are two different things, let us try and identify, when I'm paying a royalty or when I'm paying a license fee, what am I paying it for? Is it for compensation to the government, or is it a fee for regulatory? The answer will be entirely different depending on whether it's a regulatory fee or a compensatory fee. Now, what is also interesting to note is there is the because of the heavy lobbying that may have happened, the union government seems to have taken a volte-face for the liquor industry. And this is very interesting. It brings out significant issues. I have nothing against the liquor industry as such, but in the context of the energy basket of the country, if iron ore, coal, if oil and gas are not important enough to be given this kind of dispensation, then this raises significant questions. What they did was, in 2019, in the GST era, they came out with a circular, okay? And this is, I'll read it verbatim for you. GST Council in its 26th meeting held on 10/3/2018 recommended that GST was not leviable on license fee and applicable application fee by whatever name it is called, payable for alcoholic liquor for human consumption, and that this would apply mutatis mutandis to the demand raised by service tax and excise authorities on license fee for alcoholic liquor for human consumption in the pre-GST era, i.e. for the period 1/4/16 to 30/6/2016. So therefore, this was a statement that the GST Council decided, or the position that the GST Council decided, saying that when it comes to liquor license, no service tax in the past, no GST in the future. This is what the GST Council said. What basis, I don't know, but they seem to have said that. And therefore, on 30th September 2019, in GST era, they came out with a very interesting amendment. They invoked the power under Section 7(2) of the GST Act to say that grant of license by the government for liquor for human consumption will be treated neither as supply of goods nor as supply of services. I ask this question for all of you to consider. If grant of license of liquor is not a supply of service, is not a supply of goods, then on what basis do we say grant of license for telecom, grant of license for mining, grant of license for oil and gas is a supply of goods or a supply of services? Are we saying that the central government or the parliament and the central government together, the executive, the delegate, as well as the plenary power maker, can distinguish what is the supply of services or supply of goods based on the industry advocacy? Are we saying that Article 14 has lost its meaning? Are we saying that there is actually an intelligible differential? If there's an intelligible differential, then what is the object that they are seeking to achieve? Are they saying the objective of the central government and the parliament is to encourage production of liquor and not the coal mines? That therefore becomes an issue that has to be considered, that once you have made a statutory notification or amendment to say that supply of liquor or license of liquor is not a supply of goods nor a supply of services, I would argue ad nauseum to say, tell me and explain on what basis is the grant of a coal license or oil license a supply of goods or a supply of services. That therefore becomes a very important thing. The second point of importance, this Section 7(2) power can be invoked under GST only insofar as governments that are discharging are engaged as public authorities. Now, the moment they assume that grant of license is done by a public authority, does it therefore not give a flavor that it is a sovereign function that is being discharged? Because a public authority is supposed to discharge sovereign function. For example, PWD is a public authority. For example, the ministries are public authorities. The secretaries are all public authorities. They are discharging a function as per the charter of that particular ministry. And once you say grant of a liquor license is nothing but a grant of an activity carried on by the public authority, I would then argue, would grant of a coal license not be a grant by a public authority? And if it is by a public authority, can it therefore not be argued that it is a sovereign function? This therefore is the question that begs our consideration. And what happened was, there were two writ petitions that came about. One came about before the Delhi High Court and one came before the Orissa High Court, where an affidavit was given by the central government. The central government gave an affidavit, the Union of India gave an affidavit very clearly saying that any service tax show cause notice that has been issued to the liquor companies in the past, they will not initiate any action against that. They will be kept in the call book till further orders, which basically meant the Union government has also accepted the GST Council's recommendation that I spoke about in the previous slide. That's a very interesting spin that has happened. I'll skip this point. Okay. Now, then comes a very interesting aspect, that assuming it is a consideration, assuming there is a consideration, assuming there is a service, assuming the government has the legislative competence to levy tax, what is the taxable event? Okay, now two very important things comes about. When I look at the notification 25 of 2012, which gave an exemption, okay, which gave an exemption that if the assignment of natural resource, right to use natural resources took place prior to 1/4/2016, it seems that the taxable event seems to be more like an assignment of right to use natural resources. When I look at the deeming fiction for telecom, they also use the word assignment by the government of the right to use radio frequency. So assignment of right to use seems to be a very, very important sine qua non for an imposition of the levy, and the government will have to satisfy if there is any assignment or not. The question is, when you get into a lease with the government, whether it's a mining lease, whether it's a production sharing contract under which you have a lease, whether it is any kind of telecom license that has been obtained, can you say that there is an assignment of a right? So therefore, is there a difference between assignment and leasing? Now, the jurisprudence of civil law, insofar as assignment and leasing is concerned, is very clear. And assignment is of an absolute nature, where the assignor steps out and the assignee steps in. Okay, whereas in a lease, it's an only it's a very limited interest that is granted to the lessor, to the lessee. So in an assignment, assigner parts with the whole property and the assignee steps in, whereas in a lease, there is a grant of an interest less than the owner's, reserving reversion. So this right of reversion is a very critical factor. In a lease, there will be a reversionary power where the lessor can take over the property after termination or whatever else. In an assignment, the reversionary power does not exist. In an assignment, the assignor steps out completely once and for all. There is no reversionary power. This jurisprudence has been laid out very clearly in the US jurisprudence, bunch of decisions that are there in the US District Court, Circuit Court, and so on and so forth, even US Supreme Court. In India, there are two or more judgments that I'm aware of where they have appreciated the distinction, and Andhra Pradesh High Court was one of the leading courts where they laid down this civil law. They actually went about appreciating the US jurisprudence and brought out the distinction that there is a difference between lease and assignment. So therefore, the question that comes out is, in any of these leases, whether it is a mining lease, whether it is a telecom license, whether it's a liquor license, okay, liquor license, I'll exclude it because they now have a statutory protection. Whether it's a mining lease, whether it's an oil and gas, we need to check whether there's a reversionary power available. And lo and behold, if you see many of these production sharing contracts, many of these main licensing thing, it comes out very clearly. The lessor at the end of the lease will take over, or reversionary power will be there. It will vest back on the lessor. The lessee may not and will not have the power to further transfer it down. Some of this restrictive covenant that goes into some of these documents goes to suggest that it was probably not an stricto sensu assignment, and they are in fact lease. And if that be the case, these being leases and not assignment, can the charge of tax survive? Because if the taxable event is implicitly or indirectly or directly perceived to be an assignment of right to use, there being no assignment, where is the question of a levy of a tax? So therefore, that is the next thing. Now, assuming that it is an assignment is the same as lease, government does all the proprieties, the next immediate question is, can delegated legislation be used to levy a tax? And I will pause here to explain why I'm raising this question. Many of these mining leases may have been issued in the 70s, maybe 80s, maybe 90s. Some may be issued after 2016, April 2016. We are not talking about them. I'm talking about the entire gamut of licenses that were probably issued before 1/4/2016. In respect of those transactions, the issue is whether I need to pay a service tax or a GST. The service tax law says that even if those may have been executed prior to the levy coming into force, as long as you have received payment after that day, you shall be paying service tax. The question is, can charge of tax be sustained on the basis of the date of receipt of payment? Ordinarily speaking, under excise law, customs law, it was very clear. On the date of the taxable event, you have to see whether you fell within the precepts of tax. If on that day you were covered by the tax, then any subsequent variation, any subsequent thing that may have happened subsequently is not going to exonerate you from payment of tax unless it has been specifically exempted. The case in hand is that of Wazir Sultan. What was the case? That came in a situation where tobacco was manufactured on a day when additional excise duty did not exist. But on the date of removal, additional excise duty came into force. The revenue wanted additional excise duty on the basis that your obligation to deposit the tax arises on the date of removal. And therefore, you must pay the tax because on the date of removal, you are liable to additional duty of tax. Supreme Court makes it very clear. There is a fundamental difference between taxable event and charge of tax and administrative convenience. The point may be shifted. Administrative convenience point was shifted to the date of removal, but on the date of manufacture, which was the charge of tax or the taxable event, the levy did not exist. And if that be the case, there is no question of levy. If we apply that same basic principle, that principle was applied in customs also in apparel industries, and it can be applied in every tax. It's a fundamental Sudarshan Chakra, if I will use that word. If we apply that, there has to be a taxable event for this particular levy. The levy, the taxable event to my mind, is nothing but the grant of the right. Grant of the right to exploit. Grant of the right to exploit the natural resources and make hay out of it and make monies out of it and so on and so forth. And that grant can take place only when the dotted lines are signed, which means there is a document through which that grant takes place by virtue of an assignment or a transfer, whichever you will call it. Apply the principle of 20th century finance, which says that the transfer of right to use takes place on the date the document is signed. And if I apply that same principle to this also, I would argue, one can argue, that the transfer of right to use natural resources took place on the date the agreement was signed. If that document took place in 1970s or 80s, much before April 1, 2016, then that so-called taxable event of assignment, so-called taxable event of transfer of right to use took place prior to the levy coming into force. Okay, if that be the case, a charge of tax cannot be sustained merely because I received the payment in an era when the tax came into force. Now, the only way the tax is being sought to be sustained today under the service tax law is because of this point of taxation rules. The point of taxation rules, which is the delegated legislation, says that insofar as new services are concerned, tax shall be levied on the date you receive payment. Tax shall be levied on the date you receive payment. So therefore, point of taxation seems to be suggesting that the services will be deemed to have been provided the date you receive payment. The question to be asked is, can the delegated legislation create a charge of tax? Outright answer to my mind is no. Assuming, and the reason why I say that, charge of tax is an essential legislative function, it cannot be delegated. Assuming that the courts were to take a very lenient view of the matter, that in today's world where there's an administrative difficulty, the doctrine of essential legislative function has gone through a sea change, and therefore some amount of elbow room should be available to the executive to be able, or the parliament to be able to operate, etc., etc., and therefore the delegate can also prescribe a charge of tax. The question that will be asked is, did the delegate have a specific power to do so? Because delegated legislation can be tested on the basis of what is specifically permitted to be delegated. Unless specifically permitted, you cannot. And the power under which point of taxation rules have been enacted does not give them any power to prescribe the taxable event. The only power the delegate had was to find out or to prescribe what is the point of tax. And what they have done is, in defining point of tax, in the rule they have said point of tax means the time when the services shall be deemed to have been provided. Where do you get this power? The power does not even exist. Your rule making power or the substantive section under which the POTR has taken birth, none of those gives you the power to tell you when the services will be deemed to have been provided. All it has said, the power is restricted to find out the rate of tax. What shall be the rate of tax in a given situation? That is all that is there. Or a point in time, that's all. There is no substantive power given to the delegate to prescribe when a taxable event can be said to have taken place or when a services can be deemed to have taken place. So therefore, we will have to necessarily look at questioning the validity of this POTR. But keeping aside POTR, I would personally believe that the very levy which is predicated on a transfer, if the transfer has taken place prior to 1/4/2016, there is no question of a levy surviving, because tax is not on payment. Tax can never be on the payment. Payment is only an antecedent. Payment is only the consideration. Payment is only the measure of tax. tax continues to be levied on the taxable event. Tax can never be on the measure of tax. And then we look at this notification. This notification very clearly seems to say that exemption applied, and the explanation or an exception carved out in the exemption is giving a suggestion that periodic payments are not exempt. And this is a habit of the central government. There are many exemptions that they come out with even though they have no propriety to levy tax. Or the exemptions are being used to create a notion that but for the exemption it was taxable. Okay. Clear principle of law is you cannot create a charge of tax through an exemption notification. If an exemption notification is seeking to create a charge of tax, which this one does, then such an exemption notification ex facie bad in law, because the exemptions are issuing using the power to grant remission. Exemptions cannot be issued to create a charge of tax, because your power cannot be derived from the from the charging section. It comes from the remission section or the rebate section. So therefore, this exemption notification, to my mind, is also questionable. Now, what is the status insofar as all these issues are concerned across the court? So the Rajasthan High Court had looked at this issue at length. Udaipur Chamber of Commerce, they seem to have taken a view that it is a consideration, royalty is a consideration, and therefore service tax should be paid. They did not take cognizance of many of the arguments on constitutional validity and so on and so forth that was discussed in the previous slides. And the India Cements whole discussion was not taken consideration of, and therefore it is I would argue that it is a per unicurium judgment. But be that as it may be, that judgment has been, service tax payable pursuant to the judgment has been stayed by the Supreme Court when it went by way of SLP. Subsequently, the same Rajasthan High Court is examining the whole issue afresh in a writ petition that has been filed by Oil India. It's a 2019. So they have not gone into this doctrine of res judicata or that it is a decided case. They are looking at it afresh by explaining, by appreciating the whole issue in the larger context that was brought out. The three high courts, Bombay High Court, Madras High Court, and Gujarat High Court, they had an occasion to appreciate this particular issue, and there are some interim orders that are there. What the Bombay and Madras High Court have done is as follows. They have said, okay, assessments can go on, but they will not issue a assessment order. And as soon as they're ready with the assessment, they can come back to the High Court, and the High Court will appreciate the issue and just adjudicate the particular dispute. Gujarat High Court has granted blanket stay on recovery, and they have said that until the 9 judges decide the issue, Gujarat High Court would not get involved, and if there's any party who wants to expedite, they can come back to the court at that point in time. But right now, they've granted a stay of recovery of tax on royalty, and therefore the industry is happy so far they are concerned. Position in GST. Now, if you notice, the fulcrum of GST is exactly the same as service tax, keeping aside the legislative competence. Okay, so insofar as legislative competence is concerned, the state and the center derive their power under Article 246. Okay, therefore you could say there's list 1 services, list 2 services, list 2 entry, and so on and so forth. They could be competing entry, dominant, eminent domain, and occupied field. Various other arguments could have been taken, which are typically taken in a fight between the center and the state. Come GST, Article 246 creates a completely new world. It's a cooperative federalism where there is a concurrent power to legislate. It overrides 246, which means that all the restraint that is available was present with the central government not to levy tax on mineral right, or the state government's exclusive power to levy tax on mineral right, is a day of the past, is a thing of the past. Because 246A says, notwithstanding anything contained in 246, there shall be a GST, etc., etc. Which means by virtue of 246A, if the central government and the state government together come about and say that I'm going to levy tax on mining rights, then I would believe that they may be okay to do that, because they are not fettered by the limits of entry 50 of list 2. They are not going to be guided by entry 53 or 54 of list 1. So therefore, that is a very fundamental distinction that may need to be appreciated by people who want to see a similarity of fate between the GST, between service tax law and the GST law. The second is that in GST, you have a supply of services or a supply of goods as the fulcrum for the imposition of tax. Now, supply of services has a very wide meaning under GST. In the service tax also, it had a very wide meaning. There was no, because post-negative lift services could be anything under the sun. Under GST as well, anything other than goods is a supply of service. Okay, so therefore the similarity exists between supply of goods, supply of services under service tax and GST. All the arguments that we were trying to develop, discuss, deliberate in the service tax era will ipso facto apply under GST situation as well. Now the issue that comes out is, if something was taxed under the service tax era, can you again be required to pay tax under GST? Let me explain that. Let us say there was this coal miner who did not want to get into all this detail, who said, okay, fine, my agreement was signed in 1975, 1985. Fair enough, I got some payment after April 1, 2016. Fair enough, I'm willing to pay service tax. Therefore, it is an admission. If the government receives the money unquestioned, then it is an admission by the government that the taxable event is on payment. Fair enough. Once GST comes, can GST be levied only on payment? Doesn't under the GST a taxable event have to take place? Because somewhere taxable event has to be crucified with the performance of an act. And if that act took place prior to April 1, 2016, or the act took place prior to GST coming into force in 2017, can the government stand on its toes and cry out aloud that, yes, I am collecting an appropriate amount called tax, merely on the basis that the consideration was received under the GST era? Isn't there a need to look at where is the taxable event? And I would say that all GST collections in respect of transactions which may have been subject to service tax in the past can ex facie be questioned, saying that the GST Act does not even apply to you. Else it would mean that GST is being sought to be levied on consideration, which is not the case. Else it would mean that Section 7 of the GST Act, which talks about the taxable event and so on and so forth, is sought to be satisfied on a retroactive basis. That is not possible. No tax legislation can be given a retroactive effect or retrospective effect unless so specified. Yes, union has an exclusive power to decide to make a legislation retrospective or retroactive, but they have not done so. Nowhere in the preamble you can see that GST Act shall apply for transactions that may have taken in the past. The only exception is with respect to transitions. That's about it. If that not be there, can GST Act have a retroactive effect by seeking to justify a collection only on or merely on the basis the consideration was received post GST? It would be an atrocious, it would be a fraud on the constitution if I were to say 265 has been given a complete go by the government seeking to recover GST insofar as these transactions is concerned. And the second thing is, if the liquor licenses can be said to be, or the grant of license by the government can be said to be neither a supply of goods nor a supply of services, I would believe that Article 14 stands completely vitiated when it comes to grant of a license to a coal miner or to an oil and gas. If supply of coal licenses is a supply of service, how is it that supply of alcohol license is not a supply of services? You cannot take a contrarian view just because it suits you. There is neither any intelligible differentia nor the differentiation is seeking to meet the object of the differentiation. There is no objective that can be seen. The only objective inherently in naked eye that can be seen is you want to push the liquor industry. Is that an object that the government should be perpetuating? To say that fair enough, for liquor industry I will give the licenses, I will not put a GST, because your DPSP does not permit you to have a liquor in the country. Directory principle, so it is against public policy. So it vitiates Article 14, it vitiates public policy, and therefore it's a good case for people to take to the court to say to, but of course there is no concept of negative equivalence. There is no concept of negative equality. You can't say just because he has got, I should also be getting the same benefit. That you may not argue. You'll probably think that this notification is bad in law. How much you are able to juggle, how much you are able to advocate basis that with the government, that's for people in the industry to figure out. But I see an ex facie violation of Article 14 insofar as this is concerned. Therefore, in conclusion, 5 points that I want you to appreciate. There are several nuanced points of law that are involved. Each contract, each license, each mode through which the licenses are granted will have to be appreciated. The vast distinction between what is a regulatory function, what is a compensatory fee, all of that is essentially a function of kind of contract that has been entered into between the parties. What applies to a given sector need not necessarily apply to the other sector. You cannot imitate, you cannot apply the same principles to your sector. How the show cause notice are being drafted by the revenue has an important bearing, because if they take a position trying to defend the levy or trying to substantiate the levy in a certain slant, then you are stuck with that slant and therefore you have to deal with that. So it may be appropriate to wait for a show cause notice and see how the revenue is dealing with that particular thing. We are noticing that the tribunals are abdicating their power to adjudicate. I don't think the tribunal should be worried about that, because you have their appellate tribunal merely because the matter is sub judice before the 9 judges. Supreme Court does not mean that you should not adjudicate the matter. You are a creature of the statute. If an appeal comes to you, you should adjudicate that particular point. 226 relief is the need of the hour to my mind, because at the end of the day, none of these issues will get decided by the lower authorities, because they being the creature of the statute, you will not get much justice that is there. Validities, etc., can't be questioned before the statutory authorities, even before the tribunal. Before the tribunal, you can take the chance, if it is coming by appeal, you will take the chance to apply a different approach before the tribunal, such that you assume the law to be interpreted in a manner that it is read down to make the law legislative or legally valid, and then take your course on that. So doctrine of reading down can be brought before the tribunal if you are faced with a situation you are not before the High Court. Otherwise, 226 is what you should think about, and ultimately we'll have to wait how the Supreme Court examines this issue in times to come. That's all that I had with me, and I think we have gone way beyond the time. I think 1.5 hours I've taken. Happy to field questions if whoever may have.
Thank you, sir, for the wonderful presentation. I think the clarity with which you have taken us through this entire topic was remarkable, sir, and a lot of points. And even as a junior, I have so whoever has question can raise your hands, and I've got a couple of messages also, so I can ask that question for you, or you yourself can ask that question. So first, we start with Mr. Sundareswaran, sir.
Hello.
Sundareswaran, sir, you can ask your question.
Yes, sir. Mr. Ghosh was very interesting. It was I was able to understand the rhyme and reason why, as per the point of the assessee, it is not taxable. But see, there is no rhyme or logic for the purpose of levying service tax, because the Supreme Court has said that there is no need of any service at all. Number one. Then number two is that Kesoram Industries have doubted the earlier order and said that it's a typographical mistake. Number two. Then number three is that whether the reference to the larger bench may not have any bearing on the present batch of cases at all, because my understanding is in all these cases the service tax is levied on the amount of excavation or the amount of extraction which the assessee takes out from the oil, minerals, or as the case may be. It is not on the license fee to an extent of knowledge. And number three is that the section 66B4 says what is service? Service is an activity. The central government allows the party to excavate or to enjoy the property which is excavated from the property, and so for the purpose of allowing them to take it with some measure, they are asking to pay the service tax. And the point which the Udaipur Chamber of Commerce was admitted before Supreme Court was SLP was pending. SLP was admitted and it was pending. Madras High Court had admitted a writ petition only on the ground that the matter was pending in Supreme Court. It doesn't relate to any other point. And indeed, at the time of admission, the judge was not inclined to admit at all. And I just wanted to say that how the Kesoram Industries have a bearing on this, and how the the larger bench reference have a bearing on it, because those cases says whether it's a tax or not. Here we are only on service point, whether the activity will amount to jurisdiction empowering the central government to impose service tax. That's all.
Thank you, Sundesh, for your questions. And I think all of these questions that you asked are very, very important. So let me take one after the other. If I miss out anything, remind me. Indeed, Kesoram has questioned the validity of or the propriety or the correctness of India Cements. Indeed, Kesoram has said that it was a typographical error. It's a typographical error. But when you read India Cement properly, you will actually find that it is not there in one place. It is there in several places. So therefore either it is a typographical mistake in every place that is far too coincidental, or that whoever appeared before in Kesoram's case could not. That is one point. But be that as it may be, yes, Kesoram has doubted, and that is a very fair, strong ammunition available to the revenue to argue before the court. But the question is, in a 226 matter, the question is, when I'm before a commissioner, who is the commissioner or the 226 authority bound by? Is he bound by a wrong decision of the Supreme Court, assuming India Cement was wrong? Or is he bound by so-called correct interpretation of Kesoram, assuming Kesoram was right? The answer is very clear.
Yes.
7 judges of Supreme Court, if it is wrong, you still have to abide by under 141. A lower judicial authority has no judicial discretion to take a view one way or the other, saying that I will follow 7 judges, I will not follow 5, or vice versa. Right now, therefore, the point is, why India Cement judgment or the larger bench reference is very important. That's the question, Sundaresh, you had asked. The only reason why it is important is the argument that royalty is per se a tax will be decided once and for all by the 9 judges.
Yes.
It has no bearing on license fee, admittedly. It has no bearing on license fee, and you're absolutely right that so to the extent service tax or GST was sought to be levied or is being levied on non-royalty portion, which is dead rent, surface rent, license fee, by whatever name called, this whole dispute of whether it's a tax or non-tax is wholly irrelevant. Okay.
Yes.
The third point that you mentioned, that there is a service that the government has provided. Well, that itself is $1 million question. And that is why half the problem will be, is there at all a service? I mean, the notion of service has to be understood. And for the first time in the history of Indian jurisprudence, the Supreme Court will actually go into the details of what itself is a service. It is an esoteric concept. It is intangible. There has to be some value that has to be created, which means somebody has to have something which he is parting with to the other. You can say the service is, and if I were a revenue counsel, I would say parting of the privilege is the service.
Yes.
Okay. But then the counter that will come, parting of the privilege is a regulatory function. And if it is a regular function, the Supreme Court itself has said that there is no service involved. If it is a compensatory, only then service tax comes into place. You know, Secunderabad Hotel's judgment of the AP High Court is very clear on that. Dam organics of Allahabad High Court read with the Supreme Court is very clear on that. There are any number of judgments that are there where the distinction between regulatory function and compensatory function has been brought out. So arguments are there on both sides, which is why at the opening I said, I wanted to put a fair picture of it. I am not holding anybody's brief. I can be the amicus, if you like, for this evening.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sundaresh sir, for your question. Sir, we have Mr. Vikas Mittal to ask a question, sir. I'll just unmute him. Mr. Vikas?
Yeah, hello.
Hello, sir. You can ask your question, sir.
Yeah, sir, very good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Hello, can you hear me, sir?
Yes, Vikas, I can hear you.
Yes, sir. So my question is that you said that, any lease which was granted prior to 1/7/2017 or even prior to 2016 on which the service tax was being paid, it cannot be made exigible to GST because the taxable event has taken place prior to 1/7/2017. So by that logic, even the lease of immovable property which was granted way back, let's say in 2012, 2013, on that also no service tax can be charged. Even GST cannot be charged.
Absolutely. 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 And I'll tell you where I'm coming from. Okay. You understand, you remember 20th century finance, right? What was 20th century finance all about? In 20th century finance, Supreme Court was trying to figure out what is the taxable event for a lease under sales tax, deemed sales, right? And then they said the taxable event for lease would be the date when the transfer of right to use takes place. And transfer of right to use takes place only at the time when the execution of the contract, which means signing of the contract leads to vesting of the right from one to the other. Therefore, that was the trigger. Subsequent usage is subsequently when the asset is in the possession of the person, any tax that is being sought to be levied on that will be a tax on usage, not a tax on transfer of right to use. That's the fundamental distinction in the deemed sale concept under 360/2029A. Tax on transfer of right to use goods is different from tax on usage. Okay. And therefore, tax on usage could mean as you use, you pay the tax. But if the levy is on transfer of right to use of natural resource, then the only way that event can be said to have taken place is the day when the event took place of transfer. which is signified by the lease agreement. If the lease agreement was signed, whether for property, whether for the mining leases, etc., prior to the levy coming into force, I doubt whether there is any propriety to levy tax, because to my mind, tax cannot be levied based on only on the fact of consideration having been received. There's no question of that. It would be completely a fraud on the constitution, completely antithetical to 265.
Thank you, sir. Sir, so if the time permits, sir, there are 2-3 more questions, sir. As
Sure.
per your convenience.
Sure.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Mr. Yogesh?
Yeah.
Yes, you
So,
can.
so we have discussed that after the Article 246A coming into picture, overriding Article 246, there may be a different position than service tax. So please guide me, because I hold a different understanding that Article 246A overriding Article 246 having a non-obstante clause would not mean that the powers of state present in list 2 for levy of tax on land or mining rights would be diluted, because tax on these royalties in itself is a tax, or this royalty this comes into the purview of the entry under list 2. So can we say that even after Article 246A, the overriding provision of Article 246A would not dilute in any mean the powers of state? Because that also mean, if we consider that it will dilute the power of states to levy tax on entries present in list 2, that would also mean that the custom duty, which is on the imports, and import is also a supply of goods or service, would also be diluted on the end at the end of the parliament. So can you just guide me on this?
So your point is correct, that the exclusive jurisdiction of the union government or the specific power available with the union government or the state government to impose tax, unless otherwise amended, is unfettered. No doubt about that. But look at 246A as a concept. It's a cooperative federalism where the state and center together have come about saying that I'm abdicating my so-called kingdom or fiefdom, if I will, if I can use that word, under 246 and my respective lists, and I'm coming together under 246A, notwithstanding anything under 246, to come to a common ground. And in coming to the common ground, the states and the center together wants to levy a GST on royalty. Can you say that the states are now, can we not say that the states are not complicit? Because the GST legislation is both by the central government and the state government. Unlike Finance Act, which was a unilateral statute from the central government, states were not concerned. In a situation where the state and the center together have come together, can we not say the state is complicit and said, fair enough, there is a limitation that I want to put by virtue of 246A? It's a common ground where we are trying to say that in respect to what 246 may be, so far as this is concerned, I will levy tax on that. And it's very interesting. The reason or the rationale on which 246 or the service tax will be justified will become or may become the Damocles sword for justifying GST. If the union government were to justify levy of GST service tax under entry 97, saying that it is a residuary power, and that there was a limiting available with the central government by virtue of the regulatory function and so on and so forth, then that residuary power has also been made subject to 246A. You get what I'm saying? 248 has also been made subject to 246A.
Absolutely.
So therefore, the real test will depend on what position the revenue takes, or what position the Union of India takes insofar as justifying service tax is concerned. If they say that that power to levy service tax is derived under 97, then they have actually sealed their fate. Then under GST, they will have a hard time trying to justify under what propriety they are trying to justify the levy. My only point was that because 246A comes with a non-obstante clause, this is a very nuanced difference that can be seen between 246, the list, the segregation of list, and what 246A talks about. That is the limited point I was trying to make.
Absolutely, sir. Sir, just a small rejoinder question. So after Article 246A, can we not say that the aspect theory has no, standing after Article 246A, because the aspect theory has a premise on the distinction of list 1 and list 2, and because Article 246A has come, so we cannot compare the aspect under Article 246A to the aspect under list 2.
Correct. I agree with you. I agree with you that aspect theory has died a long death after 246A has come into force.
Sure. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Yogesh. Sir, one question from Mr. Irshad. Mr. Irshad, if you can
Yeah.
hear me, you can
Yeah.
you can ask a question.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Good evening, Mr. Ghosh. My question is regarding the latest developments in advanced ruling area on NMET and DMF charges that are collected by respective state governments, and the application of the levy of GST on these charges as well. So the advanced rulings in NMDC case that we have seen, they are wholly based on the collection of royalty. That means if you collect royalty, since these charges are based on royalty, you have to pay the GST because you are paying GST on the royalty. So we have seen, I've seen your presentation, fully agree. Even if we say there is no tax on royalty, can we still justify saying that there won't be GST leviable on DMF and NMET solely because they originate from a statute, and the purpose is well defined in that statute. So there is no quid pro quo for argument's sake. I mean,
correct.
So,
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we'll have to one argument that is very easily available for that kind of DMF and all of that, at least in the mining sector, is that, you know, we have to see what the money is being used for. If the money is going to the social welfare, if the money is going for the labor welfare, etc., without there being a direct nexus with what the collection is for, you can hardly say that there is a quid pro quo. For example, if you say that this money has been collected for the purposes of the aborigines in that area, the locals in that area, etc., and you specifically say that in so many words, and it actually goes to a certain cantonment board or some kind of board only for that purposes, maybe there is a quid pro quo. But if it goes and sits in the consolidated fund of the state, and from there is an allocation that happens, then it is certainly not, there is no quid pro quo that can be said about it at all. And the more important thing is some of these advanced rulings that have come about, and I've read a few of them. Well, some of the larger issues have not been dealt with, and they couldn't have been dealt with so far the constitutional propriety is concerned. I guess you'll have to go on appeal to the AR, triple AR, if not triple AR, then maybe to the High Court, subject of course to the precepts of judicial review under 226, whether it is a matter that can be reviewed by the High Court or not, as a under 226.
thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Irshad. So just with your permission, I would just want to call Mr. Natarajan. He just wanted to tell a few words, and then
Yes.
Mr. Aditya Reddy, sir.
Sure.
Yes, sir, Natarajan, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Sujit Ghosh. By the time around 4:45, clouds were gathering around Chennai, and for the past 1.5 hours.
I'm sorry, Natarajan, sir, your voice is not very clear. Can you?
By around 4:45, when the session started, clouds were gathering over the Chennai, and for the past 1.5 hours, we had a very great downpour. And after listening to you for this 1.5 hours, what we notice is that the government has fallen for a peg of whiskey or wine. So in their eagerness to please the liquor industry, they have opened the floodgates, and we have got a lot more to argue now. And in fact, the GST Council has walked a lot of extra miles. And what is their right to comment about the service tax applicability on the liquor license? Their job is to comment upon the GST applicability. They walk some extra mile and comment about the service tax applicability also. And all these things are very favorable factors for us. And thank you for the enlightening session, sir.
Thank you very much. It was nice of you to say that, and I also thank all of you to be here around on a Saturday evening. Of course, in today's world, how does it matter whether it's a Saturday or a Sunday? Every day is a Saturday or a Sunday. But
Absolutely.
nevertheless, taking time out and listening to me for 2 hours, I'm really privileged.
Sir, there's one small request from Mr. Vikas Mittal to just ask one quick question, sir, if you permit, sir.
Sure.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, this is regarding the aspect theory which just now you discussed, sir. Sir, what you mentioned that with Article 246A, which overrides, Article 246 and the lists in Schedule 7, sir. In that respect, sir, may I indicate that, say, GST under 246A is payable on electricity also. Okay, therefore, the state exercises its power under 246A to levy GST on electricity, although it attracts nil rate of GST. But then the power in Schedule 2 to levy electricity duty is still continued. And a person who is consuming or supplying power continues to pay electricity duty also. So can we say that, that overlapping will not be there anymore, or in fact overlapping will continue? As a matter of fact, sir, in the case of import of goods, sir, we are making payment of customs duty in terms of entry Schedule 1, List 1, and also IGST in terms of Article 246A.
No,
Or,
so
that is
okay,
Article 269, sir.
So
Right.
Vikas, your point is valid to an extent, but let me clarify that. Insofar as electricity is concerned, what the state levies is a tax on distribution. Okay, the state does not levy tax on generation. Remember that. Okay, so generation was never within the four corners of the state's power to levy tax on. So far as GST is concerned, do the states or the center today assume a power to levy tax on the GST on electricity? Well, I'll tell you what has happened. Original white paper that was submitted before the parliament proposed that they should be subject to tax. Subsequently, when the committee of ministers came out, a group of ministers came out with the final finding, and they made that recommendation, the government completely disagreed with that, and they said that we will not keep GST within the net of, will not keep electricity within the net of GST. It was not, the proposal was that electricity should be zero rated. If you don't want to levy tax, at least zero rated. They said neither zero rating nor will it be subject to an liability, etc. At one point in time, people say that, okay, at least put a small 0.5%, because what was happening, and I'm sorry, I'm digressing a bit. All the power plants which were purchasing equipment under this in-transit mode, where excise duty was exempt and the only levy was CST, was purchasing at a net tax cost of only 2% CST through a contracting mode. So let's say BHEL supplied to L&T and L&T supplied to the NTPC. The only tax that was levied was 2% at the CST level from BHEL to L&T. Come GST, everything became 18%. So the power generator suddenly, instead of having a cost of 2%, that too on the price at which the OEM had supplied BHEL, suddenly started bearing a cost of 18% on the contractor's selling price. And the only way they could have got recuperated this significant surge in the taxes by claiming it as a zero rate. That's what the industry wanted. They did not. So I don't believe that electricity is within the GST net today. We may say that there is an exemption, and therefore there is an assumption that there was, it's part of the GST. But frankly speaking, at a policy level, it was never there in the GST. But be that as it may be, the tax that we are talking about, that the state has a power, is only a tax on distribution and distribution alone. No tax exists on generation. Point one. Point two, the point on imports that you mentioned about on the IGST. Well, if you see IGST is on a different element, and customs duty is on a different element. Why has it happened so? A CVD and an SAD has come to the IGST part, and a basic customs duty has remained the same. The taxable event for customs continues to be import of goods. Whereas taxable event for IGST is not import of goods, it is supply. The two taxable events are different. Yes, you can say that identical transactions are being subject to two tax. Therefore, there is two different facets. I would say there are not two different facets. There are two different taxable events. There are two different taxable events. And the reason why IGST is being monitored to the customs was because of administrative convenience. That's all. That's about it. So to my mind, I don't believe the aspect theory has, beyond a point, has any relevance. The whole reason why was this aspect theory happening? If you look at the SIM cards decision, if you look at what went to Supreme Court, all those decisions that were there in telecom situation, they said that there is an aspect of sale, there is an aspect of service, and there was a competition between the state and center to say who has the property to levy tax. The argument was that since you have levied service tax, can you levy a sales tax again, and vice versa. And therefore, Supreme Court kind of said, okay, fine, there are two different aspects of the same transaction, the iMagic decision, etc. And therefore, we have to see the aspect. Now, what aspect will you see? Because from a tax perspective, 246, both of you are together on the same table. What aspect are you going to see? There is only one aspect of that, which is the supply of goods or services. And constitutionally, you have defined what a GST is about. You have defined what a GST is tax on supply of goods or services without any distinction between whether it's a central or state. The only distinction is IGST versus CGST. So I personally don't believe that this aspect theory has much relevance, but if there are illustrative cases that you have in mind, happy to discuss offline.
Thank you, Sujit sir, for your patient answering of all the questions. So there has been a request from many participants if we can get the PowerPoint presentation, sir. So if you, subject to your permission, sir, if we can get your PowerPoint presentation, we will try to share to as many participants as possible.
Sure. I mean, I have absolutely, the whole idea is to share knowledge. Absolutely
yes,
no
sir.
difficulty. I will send the version to Aditya.
Yes, sir. Sure,
same version, I'll send it to Aditya and you can please transmit it out. There is no difficulty at all.
Sure, sir. Thank you very much, sir. Sir, now I'm just bringing in Mr. Aditya Reddy just to tell us. Thank you, sir.
Good evening. Just a brief vote of thanks on behalf of the Madras Tax Bar. First of all, to Mr. Sujit Ghosh for taking the time out to make such a wonderful presentation for all of us. We have had one of the largest gatherings for our webinar series, which has been happening for the last 2 weeks. So thanks a lot, Sujit. And secondly, thanks all to the professionals. Most importantly, His Lordship Justice Challa Kodandram, who's been here right from the beginning till the end, so patiently listening to Mr. Sujit Ghosh and all the other professionals, auditors, lawyers, industry leaders who've been with us. Thanks a lot on behalf of the Madras Tax Bar.
Thank you. Thank you all. It was a privilege. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir, for